You remember the 1970s for Watergate and polyester leisure suits, but walk into any American kitchen back then, and you'd find something far more interesting happening at the dinner table. Pork chops weren't just meat. They were the canvas for some of the wildest culinary experiments this country has ever seen. We're talking recipes that mix convenience with creativity, turning weeknight dinners into something families actually look forward to. Today, we're counting down 25 pork chop recipes from the 1970s that have completely vanished from modern kitchens. Some of these will make you nostalgic. Others might surprise you, but all of them fed real families across America during a decade of unprecedented change. Shake and bake pork chops. General Foods launched Shake and Bake in 1965, but it didn't become a household phenomenon until the 1970s when working mothers needed dinner solutions that didn't involve an hour of babysitting a hot stove. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Inside that familiar yellow box came a plastic bag and a pouch of seasoned breadcrumb mixture. You dump those breadcrumbs into the bag, toss in your thick-cut bone-in pork chops, seal everything up, and hand it to your kids. They'd shake that bag like they were making a maracas solo, coating every inch of meat with that magical mixture. The coating itself was engineering genius. Breadcrumbs blended with paprika, garlic powder, onion powder, and whatever secret spices the General Foods chemist had perfected. After 25 minutes in a 400-degree oven on a foil-lined sheet pan, you'd pull out pork chops with a golden brown crust that actually crunched when you bit into it. The meat underneath stayed juicy because you never touched it with oil or butter. This wasn't just convenient. It was liberation for women entering the workforce in record numbers. Restaurant quality results without the mess, the oil splatter, or the constant attention frying demanded. Today's air fryer obsession is basically trying to recreate what Shake and Bake perfected half a century ago, except now we act like we invented it. Breaded pork chops. Before Shake and Bake promised convenience in a box, there was a ritual of hand-breading pork chops, a technique every 1970s cook learned from their mother or learned through trial and error. This was real cooking that required attention and skill. You'd set up your breading station, like an assembly line across your counter. First came a shallow dish of flour seasoned with salt and pepper. Next, a bowl of beaten eggs mixed with a splash of milk to thin them out. Finally, a plate of fine breadcrumbs seasoned generously with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika for color. The process was meditative. Dredge each thick-cut chop through the flour, coating it completely and shaking off the excess. Dip it into that egg wash, letting the excess drip back into the bowl. Then press it firmly into those seasoned breadcrumbs, making sure every surface was coated like armor. The key that separated amateurs from experts was letting those breaded chops rest for 10 minutes before frying. This allowed the coating to set up properly so it wouldn't fall off in the pan. Heat a cast iron skillet with a 1/4 inch of vegetable oil until it shimmered and you could feel the heat radiating up. Carefully lay those chops in hot oil and fry for 5 minutes per side until the crust turned deep golden brown and audibly crackled when you move them. The result was a crunchy, savory shell that shattered when you bit into it, giving way to juicy, tender pork inside. This was the original fried chicken experience applied to pork. Comfort food that required real skill and attention, but rewarded you with something truly special. French onion pork chops. When Lipton's French onion soup mix hit American pantries in the 1950s, it took another decade for home cooks to fully realize its true potential. By the 1970s, they figured out it could turn ordinary pork chops into something that tasted like you'd slaved over a French bistro stove all day. The method was absurdly simple, which made it perfect. Brown your thick-cut chops in butter until they developed that golden color, creating all those beautiful caramelized bits stuck to the bottom of your skillet. Those bits were flavor gold. Remove the meat temporarily. Toss sliced onions into that porky butter and let them soften and sweeten. Then came the magic ingredient. Sprinkle an entire envelope of Lipton's French onion soup mix over those softening onions. That magical blend of dehydrated onions, beef bouillon, and mysterious umami powder that food scientists had perfected. Add a splash of water or white wine if you were feeling fancy to deglaze, scraping up all those brown bits from the bottom. Nestle your chops back into this mixture. Reduce the heat to low and let everything braise together for 30 minutes. During that time, the onions would turn jammy and almost melt. The soup mix would dissolve and concentrate into this rich gravy that tasted like you made French onion soup from scratch. The result tasted like slow-cooked French onion soup, had a baby with perfectly cooked pork. Served over egg noodles or mashed potatoes to soak up every drop of that oniony, savory sauce. Onion soup mix pork chops. Lipton's onion soup mix was a magic ingredient that saved countless dinners throughout the 1970s, and nowhere did it shine brighter than when sprinkled over pork chops. The genius lived entirely in the simplicity. Place your thick-cut chops in a baking dish, arranging them so they weren't overlapping. Sprinkle the entire contents of one soup mix packet directly over them like you're applying fairy dust. Don't be shy about it. That whole packet needed to get used. Add a cup of water to the bottom of the pan to create steam and prevent burning. Cover the dish tightly with aluminum foil and bake at 350 degrees for an hour. During that time, something magical occurred. The dehydrated onions rehydrated and softened, becoming tender and sweet. The bouillon dissolved into a rich gravy that formed at the bottom of the pan. Those mysterious secret seasonings infused every fiber of the meat, penetrating deep inside. When you pulled that foil back, you'd find pork chops swimming in golden brown gravy thick enough to coat a spoon, studded with caramelized onion bits throughout. The chops themselves would be so tender they'd fall apart with just a fork, practically melting. That gravy demanded to be soaked up by mashed potatoes or rice, or even just white bread. This was the recipe desperate mothers made on nights when they'd forgotten to plan dinner and had nothing thawed, pulling ingredients from the pantry, and somehow creating something that tasted like they'd been cooking all day. The packet cost maybe 50 cents and fed a family of 4. Cream of mushroom pork chop casserole. Before food snobs declared condensed soup déclassé, the cream of mushroom pork chop casserole anchored Wednesday night dinners from Maine to California. This recipe embodied pure 1970s efficiency. You'd brown 4 thick pork chops in your cast iron skillet until they developed that deep golden crust on both sides. Then you'd nestle them into a baking dish alongside sliced onions and quarter potatoes. Here's where it got interesting. You'd take 2 cans of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and pour them directly over everything, undiluted. That thick, creamy soup would coat every surface. Add maybe half a cup of milk to loosen things up slightly. Then slide the whole dish into a 350-degree oven for an hour. What emerged was practically magic. The pork chops became so tender they'd fall apart with just a fork. The onions melted into sweet submission. The potatoes soaked up every drop of that mushroom-laden sauce, becoming creamy on the inside with slightly crispy edges where they peaked above the liquid. The sauce itself thickened into this luxurious gravy, studded with actual mushroom pieces. This was comfort food engineering at its absolute finest. You put in minimal effort and got maximum satisfaction with exactly one dish to clean. Modern dump dinners and slow cooker recipes are just reinventing what Grandma already knew: pork chop and potato bake. This Midwest church supper staple combined 2 family favorites into one glorious pan that fed crowds without breaking anyone's budget. The construction required some thought. Slice 4 large russet potatoes into rounds about a 1/4 inch thick. The thickness mattered. Too thin, and they'd disintegrate during cooking. Too thick, and they wouldn't cook through properly. Layer half those potato slices in a greased 9 by 13 inch baking dish, seasoning them generously with salt and pepper. You weren't being shy here. Those potatoes needed flavor. Arrange brown pork chops over the top of that first potato layer. Then cover the chops with the remaining potato slices, creating this potato-pork-potato sandwich situation. Now came the magic binding agent. Mix a can of cream of celery soup with half a cup of milk and a handful of shredded cheddar cheese, creating this rich, cheesy sauce. Pour this mixture over everything, making sure it seeped down between the layers. Dot the top with pats of butter for richness and browning. Cover the whole thing with foil and bake at 375 degrees for an hour. The potatoes would steam and soften, absorbing all those pork juices and that creamy sauce. Remove the foil for the last 15 minutes to let the top potatoes crisp up and develop some color. What emerged was layers of tender potatoes, infused with pork flavor, held together by that cheesy, creamy sauce. This was one-dish dinner perfection that stretched a modest meat budget to feed a family of 6. Pork chops and rice casserole. This recipe represented the ultimate set-it-and-forget-it dinner that turned skeptical husbands into believers. The method seemed almost too simple to work, which made it perfect for the 1970s. Start with a layer of uncooked long-grain white rice spread across the bottom of a 9 by 13-inch baking dish. Yes, completely uncooked rice straight from the box. Arrange brown pork chops on top of that raw rice, like you're tucking them into bed for a long nap. Now here's where the magic happened. Mix a can of cream of mushroom soup with a can of cream of chicken soup. Thin this mixture out with 2 cups of water or chicken broth, creating what essentially became your cooking liquid and sauce all in one. Pour this over everything, making sure the liquid covered the rice completely, or you'd end up with crunchy bits. Season the tops of the chops with salt, pepper, and paprika for color. Seal the entire dish tightly with aluminum foil and bake at 350 degrees for 90 minutes. During that time, something beautiful occurred. The rice absorbed all that liquid, expanding and softening. The condensed soups melted into a creamy sauce. The pork chops steamed to perfect tenderness, their juices dripping down into the rice below. When you pulled off that foil, you had a complete meal in one dish. The rice was perfectly cooked, the pork fell apart, and everything was coated in that rich, creamy sauce. This was the recipe working mothers photocopied and passed around like contraband, a lifesaver for nights when you needed dinner to happen without supervision. Pork chops and sauerkraut. German heritage crashed into American convenience with this Pennsylvania Dutch-inspired staple that graced tables from Pittsburgh all the way to the Dakotas. The beauty lived in its rustic simplicity. You'd start by layering the bottom of a heavy Dutch oven with a thick bed of drained sauerkraut, the kind that came in jars or cans at every grocery store across America. Nestle your thick-cut pork chops directly into that sauerkraut. Nest like you were tucking them into bed. Season everything with caraway seeds for that distinctive German flavor, black pepper, and maybe some sliced apples if you wanted sweetness to balance the tang. Add a cup of beer or apple cider for liquid. Clamp that lid on tight and let everything braise low and slow for 2 full hours. During that time, the pork fat would render out into the sauerkraut, creating this incredibly rich, tangy sauce that tasted like old-world comfort. The sauerkraut itself would mellow from its sharp fermented bite into something sweet and sour in perfect balance. The pork would become so tender, it practically fell apart when you looked at it. This wasn't fancy restaurant cooking. It was a kind of one-pot meal that German and Eastern European immigrants had been making for generations, adapted perfectly for busy American families who needed dinner to cook itself while they lived their lives. The whole house would smell like a Bavarian tavern by dinner time. Hawaiian pork chops. The tiki bar craze of the 1960s crashed headlong into 1970s home cooking with Hawaiian pork chops, a dish that convinced suburban Americans they were dining in some Polynesian paradise without leaving their split-level ranch house. Start by browning bone-in chops in a skillet until they develop that beautiful caramelized exterior. Then you create what made this dish special. Drain a can of pineapple rings, but save that syrup like it was liquid gold. Mix that syrup with soy sauce, brown sugar, a good splash of vinegar, and a generous shake of ground ginger. This created a glossy, sweet, and salty glaze that hit every taste receptor. Arrange your brown chops in a baking dish. Top each one with a pineapple ring, securing it with a toothpick so it wouldn't slide off during cooking. Pour that glorious glaze over everything, making sure it pooled around the chops. Bake at 350 degrees for 40 minutes, basting occasionally. The pork would glisten like a Hawaiian sunset by the time you pulled it out. The pineapple edges would caramelize into these candy-like bits. Serve the whole thing over white rice, and suddenly your dining room felt like a beachfront bungalow in Waikiki. This was exotic eating for families who'd never left their home state, bringing tropical fantasy to Midwest dinner tables, one sticky, sweet bite at a time. The beauty was how it balanced savory pork with that fruit sweetness without becoming dessert. Sweet and sour pork chops. When Chinese-American takeout became a nationwide obsession in the 1970s, home cooks desperately wanted to recreate those flavors without leaving their kitchens or ordering expensive delivery. Sweet and sour pork chops became the answer, A simplified version that traded wok skills for straightforward baking that anyone could master. You'd brown your chops in a skillet first to get some color and flavor development. Then came the sauce that defined a generation of American-Chinese fusion. Ketchup formed the base. Yes, regular Heinz ketchup. Mix that with brown sugar, white vinegar, and soy sauce, whisking everything together into a thick, glossy, candy-colored coating that looked almost radioactive. Some recipes added crushed pineapple or diced bell peppers for authenticity points. Pour this magical concoction over your chops sitting in a baking dish and roast at 350 degrees for 45 minutes. The sauce would reduce during cooking into the sticky glaze that coated every inch of meat, creating a caramelized crust on the exposed edges. The result was tender pork with a flavor profile that hit every single taste bud simultaneously. Sweet from the sugar, sour from the vinegar, salty from the soy sauce, umami from the combination of everything. It wasn't authentic Chinese cooking by any stretch, but it satisfied America's craving for exotic flavors without requiring specialty ingredients or advanced techniques. Serve it over white rice, and you had a meal that felt worldly and sophisticated. Pineapple pork chops with soy glaze. The 1970s loved pineapple on everything, from pizza to ham to upside-down cake. This recipe took the Hawaiian pork chop concept and elevated it into darker, more sophisticated territory with the addition of soy sauce and fresh garlic. Start by creating a marinade that would make your taste buds stand at attention. Crushed pineapple with all its juice, soy sauce for saltiness and depth, minced fresh garlic, brown sugar for caramelization, and a splash of rice vinegar if you're fancy enough to have it in your pantry. Marinate thick-cut chops for at least 2 hours, but preferably overnight in the refrigerator, letting those flavors penetrate deep into the meat. The acid from the pineapple would also tenderize slightly. When ready to cook, remove the chops and reserve that marinade. This is important. Pour the marinade into a small saucepan and boil it down until it reduced to a thick, glossy glaze that coated the back of a spoon. This concentration intensified all the flavors. Grill or pan fry the chops until beautifully charred on both sides. Then brush them repeatedly with that concentrated glaze during the last few minutes of cooking, building up layers of flavor. The result was pork with a caramelized crust that was sweet and salty in equal measure, with a depth of flavor that transcended its simple ingredients. The pineapple and soy created this incredible umami-sweet combination. This was Backyard Barbecue Meat's Polynesian restaurant, and it made grown men weep with joy at summer cookouts. Orange ginger pork chops. The 1970s obsession with ginger was real, driven by Americans' growing interest in Asian flavors. This recipe showcased ginger's ability to add warmth and complexity to simple proteins. Create a marinade that would wake up your taste buds. Fresh orange juice, freshly grated ginger, about a tablespoon's worth, soy sauce, brown sugar, and a squeeze of fresh garlic. The ginger was crucial here. It needed to be fresh, not the dried powder from your spice rack, to deliver that bright, zingy heat that defined the dish. Marinate your chops for at least 4 hours. Turn them occasionally so every surface got coated. When ready to cook, remove the chops and reserve that marinade. Pour into a small saucepan and reduce it down to a thick glaze, concentrating all those flavors. Grill or pan sear the chops, brushing with that reduced glaze multiple times to build up layers of flavor. The ginger would caramelize slightly, creating these savory sweet bits on the pork's surface that added texture. The orange provided fruity brightness that cut through the meat's richness, while the soy sauce added saltiness and depth. This was Asian-inspired cooking before fusion became a buzzword, bringing sophisticated flavors to suburban kitchens one ginger root at a time. The combination tasted worldly and exotic, making families feel like they were dining at a fancy Asian restaurant. Golden mushroom soup pork chops. Campbell's golden mushroom soup was a sophisticated cousin of cream of mushroom, with a deeper, richer flavor and an almost beefy undertone that elevated everything it touched. This recipe was almost too easy to be as good as it tasted, which made skeptics doubt it until they tried it. Brown your pork chops in a skillet until golden on both sides. Then set them aside while you built the sauce. In that same skillet with all those beautiful brown bits stuck to the bottom, dump an entire can of golden mushroom soup straight from a can. No water, no milk, nothing to dilute it. Let it heat up and start to loosen, using a wooden spoon to scrape the bottom and incorporate all that fond into the sauce. Nestle the chops back into that thick, luxurious soup. Add sliced fresh mushrooms if you want to go wild, and actually include real mushroom pieces. Let everything simmer together for 30 minutes over low heat. The soup would reduce and concentrate, clinging to the meat like velvet. The mushroom flavor would intensify, becoming almost meaty itself. Serve this over egg noodles or a mountain of mashed potatoes, and you had a meal that tasted like you've been working on it all day when you'd actually done maybe 15 minutes of active cooking. The secret was that golden mushroom soup. It did all the heavy lifting while you did none of the work. The sauce was so good people would sop it up with bread after finishing their chops. Tomato soup pork chops. Before marinara sauce dominated American kitchens, Campbell's tomato soup provided the tomato flavor for countless dishes. This recipe turned that familiar red soup into a tangy sweet sauce that somehow worked perfectly with pork. Brown your chops to get good color and flavor development. Set them aside while you built the sauce in the same pan. Pour in a can of condensed tomato soup with no water added. Add a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce for depth, a spoonful of brown sugar for sweetness, and a splash of vinegar for brightness and tang. Some cooks added diced green peppers and onion for texture and flavor if they want to get fancy. Return the chops to this tomato mixture. Cover and simmer for 40 minutes until the pork turned tender and the sauce reduced to a thick, ketchup-like consistency that clung to the meat. The flavor was nostalgic and comforting, somewhere between meatloaf and sweet and sour pork, with that unmistakable Campbell's tomato soup taste that defined childhood lunches. This was poverty cooking that tasted like love, turning the cheapest ingredients into something the whole family devoured without complaints. The tomato soup cost maybe 30 cents and turned budget pork chops into something special. Cream of vegetable pork chops. Campbell didn't stop at mushroom soup. They had an entire line of condensed vegetable soups that 1970s cooks weaponized for dinner with impressive results. This recipe worked with cream of celery, cream of asparagus, or even the exotic cream of broccoli. The method stayed the same regardless of which soup you chose. Brown your chops to develop flavor. Place them in a baking dish. Dump the entire can of soup over them undiluted. Add a splash of milk to thin it slightly, but not too much or you'd end up with watery sauce. Bake covered at 350 degrees for 50 minutes. Each soup created a completely different flavor profile, giving you variety without learning new techniques. Celery was mild and earthy, letting the pork shine through. Asparagus added springtime brightness that felt lighter and more refined. Broccoli brought a subtle vegetable sweetness that kids actually ate without complaining. The soup would break down during cooking, creating this creamy sauce that coated every inch of pork. The vegetables in the soup, though reduced in nearly invisible specks, still contributed flavor and gave the illusion of a complete meal. This was convenience cooking at its absolute peak. Open can, pour, bake, eat. No one questioned whether it was real cooking because it tasted too good to care about semantics. Apple stuffed pork chops. When 1970s recipes called for stuffed pork chops, they weren't messing around. They meant actual pockets carved into thick cut chops like edible purses waiting to be filled with flavor. This required some knife skills. Using a sharp paring knife, you'd cut a horizontal slit into the side of each 2-inch thick chop, creating a cavity without cutting all the way through to the other side. The pocket needed to be deep enough to hold stuffing, but stable enough not to fall apart. The stuffing was autumn in a bowl. Diced Granny Smith apples for tartness, day-old bread cubes for structure, diced onion, celery for savory balance, a handful of raisins for concentrated sweetness, and a shower of cinnamon and sage that made the whole kitchen smell like Thanksgiving. You'd saute this mixture in butter until fragrant and the vegetables softened. Then came the careful work of stuffing those pockets. Pack the filling in firmly, but not so tight that it would burst out during cooking. Secure with toothpicks if needed, threading them through like you're sewing the chops shut. Brown the stuffed chops in butter on both sides to seal in the filling and develop flavor. Then finish in a 350-degree oven for 40 minutes. During that time, the apples would soften and release their juices, mingle with the pork fat to create this sweet, savory filling that tasted like Thanksgiving met a pork chop. The bread would soak up all those juices, becoming almost custard-like. This was special occasion cooking. Too fussy for weeknights, but perfect for impressing dinner guests who thought they'd seen everything at potlucks. Parmesan pork chops. When Italian-American food conquered suburban dinner tables in the 1970s, this recipe became the pork chop equivalent of chicken parmesan, minus the tomato sauce that would make it too familiar. The preparation followed the classic breading protocol that every good cook knew. Dredge your chops in flour, dip them in beaten eggs, then press them into a mixture of Italian breadcrumbs and freshly grated Parmesan cheese. The ratio mattered significantly here. Equal parts breadcrumbs and Parmesan created maximum cheesy crust that would make people ask what your secret was. Some cooks added dried basil and oregano to the breading mixture for extra Italian credentials. Pan-fry these breaded beauties in olive oil until the coating turned golden and crispy, with the Parmesan creating these lacy crispy edges that shattered when you bit into them. The cheese flavor was concentrated and nutty, elevating the humble pork chop into something that felt restaurant-worthy. The key was using real Parmesan, not the greenkin stuff. Freshly grated from a block made all the difference. Squeeze fresh lemon over the top just before serving to cut through the richness and add brightness. This was Italian technique applied to an American staple, creating something that felt sophisticated but required nothing more than pantry ingredients and basic cooking skills that anyone could master. Glazed pork chops with apple and orange. This recipe took the classic apple and pork combination and elevated it with citrus brightness, creating a glaze that balanced sweet, tart, and savory in perfect harmony. Start by creating the glaze that would transform everything. Combine orange marmalade, apple jelly, a splash of cider vinegar for tanginess, and whole grain mustard for sophisticated bite in a small saucepan. Heat until everything melted together into liquid gold that gleamed in the light. Brown, thick cut chops in a heavy skillet to develop flavor and color. Then brush them generously with that glaze, coating every surface. Add sliced apples and orange segments to the pan around the chops, creating a fruity border. Drizzle more glaze over the fruit and the meat. Finish everything in a 350-degree oven for 30 minutes. As it cooked, the glaze would caramelize on the pork, creating this shiny, sticky coating that caught the light and looked magazine-worthy. The fruit would soften and absorb the glaze, becoming sweet tart accompaniments that were almost like chunky jam. The mustard provided just enough tangy bite to prevent the sweetness from overwhelming your palate. This was elegant enough to serve company, but easy enough for a weeknight when you wanted to feel fancy. The combination of apple and orange created this complex fruity flavor that complemented the pork perfectly, transforming ordinary ingredients into something that looked like it came from a country in menu. Beer-braised pork chops. When men finally got interested in cooking during the 1970s, recipes that involved beer suddenly proliferated across magazines and cookbooks. This one actually had legitimate culinary pedigree beyond just being an excuse to drink while cooking. Brown, thick bone-in chops in a cast-iron skillet until deeply caramelized on both sides. Those dark brown bits were pure flavor. Remove the chops temporarily. Build your braising liquid in that same pan. Sauté sliced onions in the pork fat until golden and sweet. Add minced garlic and let it bloom for 30 seconds. Then pour in a full bottle of beer. Lager or ale work best. Nothing too hoppy or would turn bitter during cooking. Add a spoonful of brown sugar to balance the beer's bitterness and a few dashes of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Return the chops to the pan, nestling them into that beer onion mixture. Cover and let everything simmer for an hour on low heat. During that time, the beer would reduce down dramatically, concentrating into a rich, slightly bitter sauce that tasted complex and sophisticated. The onions would practically dissolve, thickening the liquid naturally. The pork would absorb all those malty flavors and turn fork tender. Serve this with crusty bread to sop up that incredible sauce, and suddenly your Wednesday night dinner tasted like something from a German beer hall. This was man cooking at its finest. Simple, boozy, and undeniably delicious, proving that sometimes the simplest techniques produce the best results. Bavarian pork chops with apples. This recipe brought Oktoberfest vibes to suburban American kitchens, combining German technique with ingredients you could find at any grocery store. Start by browning thick bone-in chops in butter, getting them nice and golden on both sides to develop flavor. Remove them temporarily. Then saute sliced onions and tart apple wedges in that same butter. Granny Smith apples work perfectly because their tartness wouldn't turn to mush. Cook them until they just started to soften, but still held their shape. Deglaze the pan with apple cider or beer, scraping up all those flavorful brown bits stuck to the bottom. Add your chops back in. Season everything with caraway seeds for that distinctive German flavor, and a touch of brown sugar to balance the tartness. Cover the pan and let everything simmer together for 35 minutes. During that time, the apples would break down slightly, creating a chunky sauce that was both sweet and tangy. The onions would melt into silky strands that practically dissolved into the liquid. The pork absorbed all those flavors, becoming tender enough to cut with a fork while remaining juicy. Serve this with braised red cabbage and spatzel if you really want to commit to the theme and transport yourself to a German beer hall. Or just pile it over mashed potatoes and call it dinner. Either way, this was comfort food with an accent, bringing old world warmth to new world convenience in a way that felt both exotic and familiar. Stuffed pork chops with sauerkraut. This was a German-American answer to fancy French cuisine, proving that rustic, hearty food could be just as impressive as anything with a French name. Start with thick, cut bone-in chops at least 2 inches thick. Carve a pocket into each one, just like the apple stuffed version, but this time you're going a completely different flavor direction. Instead of sweet apples, stuff these cavities with sauerkraut that you'd squeeze completely dry. Mix that drained kraut with caraway seeds for that distinctive German flavor, diced onion that you'd soften in butter, and crumbled cooked bacon for smoky richness. The filling should be tangy, smoky, and intensely savory. Pack it into those pockets firmly and secure with toothpicks. Brown the stuffed chops in bacon fat until crusty and golden on both sides. Then braise them in a covered skillet with beer and a little brown sugar for balance. The beer would add maltiness, while the sugar would tame the sauerkraut's sharp edge. After an hour of low and slow cooking, the sauerkraut filling would mellow and sweeten. The pork would turn spoon tender, and the braising liquid would reduce to this tangy, sweet sauce that brought everything together. This was old-world cooking adapted for American kitchens, bringing Bavarian flavors to suburban dinner tables with ingredients from any grocery store. German-style pork chops with sauerkraut and bacon. This was the ultimate expression of German-American pork cookery, building layers of flavor through pork on pork on pork. Start by frying thick-cut bacon until crispy in a Dutch oven. Remove the bacon but leave all that rendered fat. Brown your pork chops in that bacon fat, getting them deeply colored on both sides. Remove the chops. Add sliced onions to the fat and cook until softened and golden. Now came the layering that made this special. Start with a bed of drained sauerkraut mixed with those softened onions in the bottom of your Dutch oven. Nestle the brown chops on top of that kraut bed. Crumble the crispy bacon over everything. Add caraway seeds for distinctive German flavor. Some authentic cooks added juniper berries if they could find them. Pour beer or chicken stock over everything, just enough to create steam. Cover tightly and braise in a 325-degree oven for 2 full hours. During that time, the pork would turn impossibly tender, practically falling apart. The sauerkraut would mellow into sweet tart perfection, absorbing all that bacon fat and pork drippings. The bacon added smoky depth throughout. The low and slow cooking melted everything together into German-American harmony. Serve with boiled potatoes and spicy brown mustard, and you had a meal that would satisfy the hungriest farmer or factory worker. Creamy pork chop and mushroom casserole. This wasn't just pork chops with mushroom soup dumped over them. This was a full-on casserole situation with layers, textures, and complexity that belied its simple origins. Start with brown pork chops as your base layer. Arrange them in a baking dish. Then add sautéed fresh mushrooms on top. About 2 cups worth of sliced buttons or cremini mushrooms that you'd cooked in butter until golden. The fresh mushrooms made all the difference. Mix cream of mushroom soup with sour cream and a splash of white wine, creating this luxuriously rich sauce that you'd pour over everything. The sour cream added tangy richness that elevated it beyond basic condensed soup. Top the whole thing with buttered breadcrumbs mixed with Parmesan cheese for a textural contrast. Bake uncovered at 375 degrees for 45 minutes until the top turned golden and crispy, while the underneath stayed creamy and luscious. The fresh mushrooms added earthy depth that the canned soup alone couldn't provide. The sour cream gave it a tangy richness that tasted almost French. The breadcrumb topping was essential, providing crunch and preventing the whole thing from being too one-note creamy. This was casserole evolution, taking the basic cream of soup method and adding just enough extra steps to make it feel special without becoming complicated. Cream of celery pork chops, the underrated cousin in Campbell's condensed soup family. Cream of celery brought a subtle, sophisticated flavor that let the pork shine without overwhelming it. This recipe was elegant simplicity at its finest. Brown your chops until golden on both sides. Arrange them in a baking dish without crowding. Pour an entire can of cream of celery soup over them, undiluted for maximum creaminess. Add just a splash of milk to loosen it slightly and a generous grinding of black pepper. Cover with aluminum foil and bake at 350 degrees for an hour. During that time, the soup would thin out into a silky sauce that coated everything. The celery flavor, mild and slightly earthy, would infuse into pork without competing for attention. Everything would become fork tender. The key was not overcooking, which would cause the sauce to break and become grainy. You wanted it to stay creamy and smooth. Serve this over rice or egg noodles, letting them soak up that delicate celery cream sauce. This was refined comfort food for people who found mushroom soup too assertive and wanted something gentler on the palate. It proved that sometimes the quietest flavors are the most memorable, especially when executed perfectly. The subtle celery flavor was sophisticated without being pretentious, making it perfect for feeding both adults and children who might reject stronger flavors. These 25 pork chop recipes fed millions of American families through one of the most transformative decades in our country's history. Some relied on convenience, others on old-world technique, but all of them brought families together around the dinner table. Which of these recipes do you remember eating as a kid? Did your mom make any of these on rotation? Or did your family have a completely different pork chop tradition? Drop a comment below and share your memories. And if you enjoyed this trip through 1970s dinner tables, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into forgotten recipes that deserve to make a comeback.